think it was riots because they were trying to sell the water system. So this is because as soon as they sell the assets to a private company, the cost to the ordinary citizen goes up terrifically. Step 2 is called capital market liberalization. And in capital market liberalization, this allows capital to flow in and out. And this is a really, if you're trying to protect your country, this is something that unfortunately happens too often. The capital market liberalization, where investment capital can flow into your economy and create bubbles. But when the bubbles are about to burst, the investment capital flows out, and that's when your currency is devalued, and that's when you get into these problems. In the currency crisis in Southeast Asia, the only country that didn't really develop this problem was Malaysia. And the reason Malaysia was able to protect itself is because they actually, the IMF said they were going to give them money, but they delayed for about 6 years. And after about 6 years, their economy picked up, whereas Japan's economy is still having problems, and some of the other, Thailand and some of the other countries in Southeast Asia. So the thing that happened in Malaysia is that they actually almost outsmarted the World Bank, but they were also lucky because they still had trading partners in the area. So if you're working in your government, if you're working for the bank, and these are the conditions, you have to understand that sometimes you have breathing room to negotiate so that your country does not become oppressed by more debt. The step 3 is called market-based pricing, and that's market-based pricing basically means that the cost of food and water and the kinds of things that people need to survive skyrocket. And then step 3.5, because of these increasing prices, they know that people are going to protest, and that's what we're seeing all around the planet right now, these protests. They call it the IMF riot, but it's not generally a riot. It's generally people protesting because the quality of their life has deteriorated. And then, of course, step 4, they call it the poverty reduction strategy, but basically, it's free trade by the rules of the World Trade Organization, and that means that the countries involved, for example, will have to take products from the north, whereas they may already have those products in their country. For example, what happened with NAFTA. After NAFTA, almost 2 million small farmers in Mexico lost their farms as a result of grain products from the north coming into the south. And so one of the goals, I think, of any country is to protect its people, and unfortunately these trade agreements sometimes are not constructive for the people of the countries in which these trade agreements, who have to suffer through these trade agreements. And the other problem is, of course, with the bank, especially we've seen this in Africa, is a lot of kickbacks. The bank, you know, they have these, what they call dictators, but the dictators are useful because the dictators will actually allow the World Bank or the IMF to come into the countries and to do their projects. The other problem with a lot of especially the big projects like the dams or the construction projects, many of them don't really benefit the ordinary people, but they are left with the expenses of paying for these things back. Who benefits? Cui bono? Well, if you saw the movie Avatar, most of you have seen the movie Avatar, and basically the movie Avatar was sort of a movie that was talking about how business, unfortunately, how large corporations sometimes are doing business without protecting the environment and without an idea that the environment or the people who live in an area should be protected. And again, this is how I got involved in these ideas, because if a corporation is polluting the the environment where people have to fish or to eat or to live, those problems end up in the doctor's office. So we're just going to talk a little bit about Africa, because Africa right now is probably being recolonized. You don't really see very much good things on television about Africa, but there are some good things. They want it to look as if Africa is not able to manage itself, but we're going to talk a little bit about Somalia and we'll see how that may not be true. Africa is a huge continent. You never really see how big it is. It's 30 million square kilometers. The United States, Argentina, India, Western Europe, and China can fit into the continent. So when you see Africa on a map, you never really see how big the continent actually is. And the continent is resource rich. As a matter of fact, most of you probably have cell phones or computers, and one of the things that comes out of the Congo is something called coltan, and you cannot make your cell phones or your computers without coltan. And Africa is still suffering from the slave trade, which destroyed many communities, and also from the period of colonization, and also now with the banking colonization. So the first world has been dumping their garbage into parts of Africa. And this is the story of Somalia. Probably over the last year you've heard about the Somali pirates. They've been in the news. They call them pirates. But let's talk a little bit about Somalia and why they call it a failed state. First of all, you notice that Somalia has the longest coastline of any country in Africa. It also is on the Gulf of Aden, in the Arabian Sea, in the Indian Ocean. 70% of all ships on the planet go through this channel, this Red Sea, Gulf of Aden channel. So it's a vital, one of the reasons there's so much problems in this area right now, because geographically this is one of the important areas in the world for trade. And also, because of where Somalia is located, its natural trading partners would be, and this part of Africa, their natural trading partners, of course, would be India and China. But the West wants to keep these countries in its sphere. However, after Somalia got its independence in 1960, by 1969, it had a coup, and it had a strongman who stayed there for almost 30 years, and they were under the influence of communist Russia. And it was at that time, the country became very oppressive. People were limited in traveling, and the gross domestic product of the country, which was low, became even lower. So by 1990, that government fell apart, and essentially Somalia was what they call a failed state. But we're going to look at Somalia because Somalia is not really a failed state. Somalia is a state which doesn't have a central bank, and for some reason they have managed, even though it's still not a prosperous country by any means, they have managed without a central bank to have an economy and an international trade. Now, one of the things that happened with these pirates is this. When Larry Summers, if I can find Larry Summers, there's Larry Summers. When he was an economist for the World Bank, Larry Summers wrote a memo, and basically he said in that memo he thought it would be a good idea to dump waste products into Africa because Africa was, quote, underpolluted. Shortly after that memo, the two companies, a Swiss company and Italian company, began dumping toxic waste off the coast of Somalia. The fishing trawlers from other countries also began to overfish the waters. And fishing is one of the ways people survived in that country. Now, the toxic waste, people began to notice that the people who lived along the shore were getting sick. But after the tsunami in 2005, huge containers began to wash up on shore, and those containers contained toxic waste from hospitals, uranium, and other kinds of chemicals. Within a short period of time, 300 people had died. And so the tribal areas began to form militias that began to go out and try to stop these ships from dumping these toxic waste into their waters. And that's their version of a navy. So the West wanted to continue dumping toxic waste into their waters, and the United States sent the Navy SEALs over there.